So today we're going to be breaking down a super bouncy and jazzy beat inside of FL Studio. So for the first sound in the melody, I went ahead and laid out some really rhythmic chords with this piano from Omnisphere. So I went ahead and grabbed the dark indie wing upright piano, and here's what that pattern ends up sounding like. So then looking at the MIDI for that, like I mentioned, it's a very rhythmic pattern with plucky chords. For all the chords in this, I stuck to 7th and 9th chords to, again, I hammer this home in every video, but just to get that jazzy feeling. How I came up with the rhythm for the chords was just trying to figure out a bossa nova type pattern and then going from there. It's one of those things where you kind of have to feel it when you're placing the notes in, and it's not really something I can explain. After those chords, I went ahead and added a bass line, and for this I actually used 3 octaves of notes to give a lot of variation so I can add a lot of bounce to the melody through the lower frequencies with the piano. Finally, moving on to the effects for that, this is pretty much my go-to vintage effect chain for pianos and guitars, so I started off with Fruity Chorus with the mix turned down to 50%, then Fruity Flangus on the default preset with the mix turned down to 40%, then Ferox on the hot recording preset, then Fruity Reverb 2 on the small room preset with the mix turned down to 40%, then an EQ just to cut the lows, and then finally Fruity Compressor on the vintage preset. The final thing I did with this is go into the sampler and change the mode to stretch, and then I automated the pitch knob, and just changing the mode to stretch makes sure that the sample doesn't time stretch when you change the pitch. So that way you can automate pitch bends, but it stays being the same sample and the same length in the playlist. Moving on to the next 2 sounds of the melody, I grabbed a pad and a Rhodes just to kind of fill up the background of the melody. So first up, I went into Analog 5 Play, and then I grabbed the Lo-Fi Celeste preset. For the pad, I grabbed the Afterthought Signs A, which is one of those sound source files within Omnisphere. So here's what those sound like once they're layered together. Starting off with the MIDI for that pad, it's really just a copy and paste of the first MIDI, but I went ahead and removed all of the chops and then all of the bass notes as well, just to get a simple filler pattern that really just emphasizes the background of the melody and just kind of fills up space. Then over to the Lo-Fi Celeste MIDI, again, it's the exact same thing where I just copied over the chords, but this time I just offset the first chord to give a little bit of variation in the melody, but again, not too much to where it's super distracting. Moving on to the effects for the pad, I started off with Fruity Chorus, again with the mix turned down to about 70%, then again an EQ just to cut the lows, and then finally an Imager just to make it feel really big and wide. Then for the effects on the Celeste piano, this is my go-to for kind of a botanica and a super textured and organic sound, so I started off with Portal on the Pitch Artifacts preset, then Fracture on the Resonant Liquidity preset with the mix turned down to about 5%, then Fracture on the Classic Beat Repeater preset with the mix turned down to 50%, then Fruity Reverb 2 on the Cathedral preset, then of course an EQ just to cut all the lows, and then finally an Ozone Imager to get it feeling super wide. For the next sounds in the melody, I grabbed 2 to kind of create a top line or an accent pattern, so I started off by grabbing this synth lead from a one-shot kit, and then I grabbed the Melancholy Times from Omnisphere. So here's what those sound like once they're combined together. Starting off with the MIDI for the synth lead, I went ahead and laid out this super simple and rhythmic pattern that almost kind of copies something that a perc would do when you're making a drum pattern. Then for the Melancholy Times MIDI, again, it's very simple, and that's really what I was keeping in mind when I was making this. So the MIDI only uses 3 notes, and I really relied on that Botanica preset that I just explained to really make it sound interesting. Starting off with the effects for those, on the synth lead, I just kept it dry, and then for the Melancholy Times, I copied that same Botanica preset that I just explained. Finally, for the last 2 sounds in the melody, I grabbed 2 bass presets. So the first one is Boo Bass, which is a stock FL Studio acoustic bass sound, and then the second one is Deep Pluck from Analog Labs 5 Play. So here's what those sound like once they're played together. Starting off with the MIDI for the boo bass, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, those just copy those lower bass notes where it was spanning 3 octaves. So as you can see that this note is a direct copy from that original MIDI, and then I just filled that in with additional notes to again, just give it a little bit more bounce. Really the only special kind of thing that I did here was make sure to leave an open space so I could transition it using the other bass, so I just wanted to leave that blank so I could fill it in later with that deep pluck preset. Then looking at the MIDI for that deep pluck, like I just explained, this kind of just transitions the melody from bass notes. Then finally for the beat, I laid out the drums. So I started off by grabbing 2 rims and laying out that bossa nova type drum pattern, so here's what it ends up sounding like. After that, I grabbed 2 kicks and made this pattern. Then I grabbed 2 rides. Then a hi-hat. Then I added this zap perk just kind of as a finishing flourish for the 4-bar loop. So once I figured out that drum pattern, I went ahead and combined everything together, and here's what it all sounds like once it's all played as a finished beat. So, yet again, that's pretty much it for the video. Pretty happy with how this turned out. I think the drum bounce is super cool. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. I don't know, man. I can't think of anything else to say. So, that's going to be pretty much it. Thanks for watching again. Bye.